everyone to our second session of this seminar series where we are learning about tracking technologies. Before we begin, I would like to give a moment so that all co-chairs can briefly introduce themselves. And this way, especially new participants get to know us. So I will begin and then I will pass it along. My name is Fabiola Rodriguez, and I am a postdoctoral associate at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I am studying how eBird data products can be used to understand bird community dynamics with a focus on the neotropics and working landscapes. So I'll pass it along now to anybody in the co-chair team.
I can jump in. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Amy. I'm work with Birds Canada. I'm based in British Columbia, and I work mostly on the Motus wildlife tracking system. And I do a variety of projects looking at migratory ecology and also do some work on shorebird population ecology.
I can go next. I'm Anna Lello-Smith. I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society as the Avian Conservation Coordinator for Mesoamerica, and I support a variety of bird research and conservation and habitat conservation projects in the region.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Maya Wilson. I work for Birds Caribbean as the Land Bird Monitoring Program Manager. And we do a lot of capacity building in the insular Caribbean, so the islands of the Caribbean, focusing within the Land Bird Monitoring Program and beyond on increasing capacity to monitor birds, including Motus. So glad to be here.
Excellent. So this is a new subcommittee within the Partners in Flight Science Committee. And so I would like to take a moment to share a couple of updates since our last meeting. One of the updates is that there is a Partners in Flight YouTube channel where you can find all sorts of Partners in Flight seminars, as well as our first seminar, which introduces where the subcommittee sits within Partners in Flight, as well as a general introduction of why tracking technologies can help us understand migration ecology. Another update is that we have our own listserv, which is a way in which we can send a lot of emails. So we had over 100 participants last time. So please take a screenshot of this QR code or email us if you wish to be added to the listserv, if you're not there yet. The third update we have is that there is an interest for this community to be one where we can build connections, collaborations to study migration ecology. So we started an Excel spreadsheet where we can list funding options or lists of people interested in studying certain topics. And we would like for the community to build and shape the list as well. So we are going to share it with you all so that you can take a look and provide feedback. We will be more specific as to how we're going to collect that feedback in the next listserv communication. But please take a look right now, well, not right now, but after, to think about how can this work. Okay, before we jump in, this is the overview of today. We have two great presentations. If there is time, there will be questions after each presentation. Otherwise, we will have plenty time to discuss what we learned from these two presenters. So with that, I will pass it along to Anna, and then we can begin.
Great, thanks so much, Fabi. And I just put the link to the Google spreadsheet that Fabi mentioned in the chat. Right now it's view only, so this is the spreadsheet to add potential collaborations, potential collaborative projects, and then also funding opportunities. It's pretty bare bones right now. I put a couple of like fake examples in each tab, but if people have feedback or ideas on features to add that could make it more useful, please let us know. And yeah, as Fabi said, we'll send an email to the listserv with more details on how you can contribute and contribute ideas on how to improve it. So with that, we'll move into our first talk. So Laura McDuffie is going to give our first presentation. Laura currently works as a data scientist and wildlife biologist at the USGS Alaska Science Center in Anchorage, Alaska. Her primary duties there include assisting scientists with public data releases, rescuing long-forgotten legacy data sets, and assisting with annual marine bird surveys and marine invertebrate sampling. Laura completed her master's degree at the University of Alaska Anchorage in 2021, where she focused on lesser yellowlegs, migratory movements, and the species' susceptibility to harvest. So her talk today will describe several key results from her research, as well as describe the benefits and disadvantages of using GPS satellite tags to track a long-distance migrant. So with that, take it away, Laura.
All right, let me share my screen and put it in presentation mode. How does that look?
That looks great.
Okay, perfect. All right. So thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to talk to all of you. So yeah, I'm currently located in rainy and warm Anchorage, Alaska, where the sun just came up, still pretty dark. So I'm gonna talk about satellite GPS tags and then give a brief overview of some of the results from my master's research that I completed in 2021. So just really briefly, I think you all probably know that there are various tracking technologies today. So bird bands are one of them. Uh, these can be either plastic color bands or metal bands with a unique identification number. To receive any information about the bird returning to a location, of course, the bird needs to be resighted or recaptured, and these bands can last for several years. And then there's PIT, which is passive integrated tech transponders. And these are electronic microchips that can read in very close proximity by receiving stations. And again, the bird needs to be close to that receiver in order for that information or data to be retrieved. And then the lifespan for those is multiple years. Then we have radio tags or telemetry tags, and these need to be picked up by a receiver as well. So the bird needs to be close to that receiver. A good example of this is the MODIS system, which has definitely gained a lot of momentum over the last 5 or so years. And then there's light level geolocators. These record ambient light levels to determine the location. This is actually the first type of tracking device that we put on lesser yellowlegs. And these are an archival tag, so you actually have to recapture the bird in order to retrieve that data. And they can last for months to a year or more. And then lastly, the tag I'm going to talk about today are satellite tags. So the transmitter or the tag sends a signal to the orbiting satellite, and then the satellite retransmits to a receiver. And this data can be retrieved through a special computer software, so the bird doesn't actually have to be recaptured. And the lifespan of these tags really depends. It can be months to a year or even slightly more. So satellite communication, specifically Argos, and how does this work? So I just want to mention that I'm definitely not an expert on this. So all the information that I have in the following slides is from the CLS Argos System User Manual. And if anybody's interested, I can share a link to that in the chat later as well. There's a lot of great information in there. So Argos is a global satellite-based location and data system that collects, processes, and disseminates data. So the Argos platform, or you can think of as a tag, receives messages from GPS satellites in low polar orbit and then automatically transmits those messages to an Argos satellite. So these tags have two different antennas. One is a GPS antenna and the other is an Argos antenna. And there's currently 9 satellites in orbit. The most recent is Kinesis, that's the name of it. The goal is for this to be a constellation of 25 dedicated satellites. And right now, I believe there's just the first 5 have actually been deployed. So these satellites are on a polar orbit at an altitude of 850 kilometers. So because of that altitude, it takes about 100 minutes for each satellite to complete a complete revolution around the Earth. So then the next step here, the Argos satellite transfers messages to a receiving station. So messages are stored on board the tag and then retransmitted to the ground each time a satellite passes over one of the 3 main receiving stations. So there's one in Virginia, one here in Alaska, and one in Norway. There are also 60 other satellite stations, although they're not the main ones. So they can also retransmit to those regional reception stations. And because of the altitude of the orbits that the satellite is in, the satellite's field of view is about 5,000 kilometers. So then the ground stations, they automatically transfer messages to Argos processing centers. And these centers calculate positions of the Argos platforms and process the data. So there's 2 main processing centers and they have redundant operations. So there's one in Washington, D.C. here in the US, and then one in Toulouse, France. So computers actually calculate the locations at these processing centers. So it checks for message quality, reception level, time lagging, platform identification numbers, sensor message lengths, frequency values, all of that information. So it deciphers all that information for the end user. So then this final step is that the processing centers automatically delivers those location results to the end user. And to retrieve this information, you have to go to a specific location. So for the Lesser Yellowlegs project, we used Argos Web is what it's called. And so that's where we could actually go and download those locations. And so there's a user service agreement, and it does cost to have an account in order to look at those data. Okay, so what I'm actually going to be discussing more of today is the GPS or the low-tech pinpoint GPS Argos tag, which is what we used for the Lesser Yellowlegs study. And so this is a picture of one. You can see it has 2 antennas. You can also see it's kind of hard to see, but this clear band. Oops, let me go back. This clear band, which shows how the harness structure, so how that was actually attached to the bird. So the pros and cons of this particular tag, the data can be retrieved without recapturing the bird, which was really helpful because lesser yellowlegs are very smart and they are difficult to recapture. You can also create a custom data collection schedule. So before you even deploy that tag on a bird, you can go into a software system and select if you want to collect locations, say every hour, every couple hours, once a day, maybe every few days, or even once a month. So you can really customize the schedules. The data are available to the end user in almost real time. So the automated Argos transmission locations are relayed after every third successful GPS fix. So you can think of a fix as a location. Um, and the locations are accurate to about 10 meters. This isn't always the case, but we did have a lesser yellowlegs lose its tag on the breeding grounds, and we were able to use those GPS locations from the tag to actually find that tag out in the wetland. So that was really helpful, and it was within 10 meters of that the tag's location. There's also various ways to attach these tags to birds. So like in that picture I showed you, this is a leg loop harness here. And low-tech can add different types of tubes or attachment, yeah, to the tag itself. So that's pretty customizable. So some of the cons, they are expensive, about 1,500 US dollars. They are, I would say, weight prohibitive for small species. They weigh about 4 grams. They do have an internal battery, like I mentioned, so you have to charge the tag before it's deployed on the bird. So there's no solar charging available with these tags. They also don't work really well in densely forested areas. They really need a clear view of the sky. And if the tag does fail or it just stops transmitting, it's really difficult to figure out why that is happening. All right, so that was just an overview of GPS tags in general. Now I'm going to describe some of the results from my master's. This is a nice video showing the tag on a Lesser Yellowlegs. All right, so the Lesser Yellowlegs, it is a sandpiper in the Scolopecidae family. So that includes the curlews, turnstones, snipe, um, and they are neotropical migrants. So they breed in the boreal forest biome of Alaska and Canada, and they spend the non-breeding period in the Caribbean and Central and South America. And like you saw in that video, these birds are commonly observed on the tops of spruce trees, which is not where you typically would think a shorebird would live or breed in a forested area like they do here in the north. So it's pretty fun to see them. Just like nearly all shorebirds that breed in North America, lesser yellowlegs are experiencing a population decline. And that's really what made us want to focus on studying this bird, because it's experienced a precipitous population decline of between 63 and 70% just since the 1970s. And this is based on the North American Shorebird Survey and the North American Breeding Bird surveys, the road-based surveys. And so it was estimated that decades ago, the population may be around 1.1 million. But with what we know today, it's likely that the population has dropped down to around 400,000 individuals. So why has this population declined by so much? could be numerous reasons, including loss of habitat. So agricultural expansion and intensification. This also includes the use of agrochemicals such as pesticides and fungicides. In terms of changing climate, wetland drying in the boreal forest due to permafrost melt and increased temperatures in the subarctic, resulting in elevated evaporation. And then unregulated harvest, which I'll discuss more later in my presentation. But they are one of the most frequently harvested shorebird species in the Caribbean and northeastern South America. Excuse me, South America. So for the study, we tagged 110 individual birds. So in this map, the number next to each location is the number of birds that received a GPS tag. So we had 6 different populations, I'm calling them, and all were breeding populations, the birds bred in that location, besides James Bay and Mingan, where those birds looked like they were more kind of moving through during their migration. So the main research objectives were basically, what are the migratory routes and migratory connectivity of this species? Where are their stopover and wintering locations? What are their stopover habitat associations? And what's the duration of stopover? And then the next main objective was really to try to identify the probability of this bird, of these populations' exposure to harvest. All right, so I'm going to jump into some results. So in terms of migratory routes and connectivity, so the figure on the left, it shows the average migratory routes per population. So I used ArcMap point and line density tool to try to find that average track. There were some gaps in the GPS data collected from these tags, so I used a random walk model to try to estimate those locations for those gaps. So A is showing autumn migration and B is showing spring migration. The sample size is not the same between the two because some tags did stop working in the spring. In terms of migratory connectivity, that's what the MC represents on this figure. That's the degree of linkage between different parts of the bird's migration. So if it were a 0, birds from different breeding sites occur in many different non-breeding or wintering sites. And if it were a 1, that would mean that all birds from the same breeding site go to the same wintering site. But what we found is that it was 0.3, which means that there is mixing of the different breeding populations within the same wintering site, but there are also not all the birds from the same population would go to the exact same wintering site. And this is just an animation of those track lines. It's kind of fun to see. Lots of migration going on there. And you can see some of the birds went offline. There's slightly fewer points in the winter, and they start moving north again. All right. So in terms of stopover non-breeding sites, you probably saw that in the animation actually, but birds tended to stop in the prairie pothole region, which is A here in autumn. And then during the winter period, the vast majority went down to Argentina. And then in the spring, many stopped along the Gulf Coast there from Central America all the way up to Louisiana. In terms of habitat associations, so I look specifically at the prairie pothole region in autumn. And so lesser yellowlegs are obviously pretty frequent occupants of that region and are most frequently associated with wetland habitats, so lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, and obviously all these pothole ponds that are throughout that region. The other interesting thing we found is that 100% of all the tracked birds from Anchorage and Canudi and Yellowknife, they all went through the prairie pothole region. And so the figure on the right shows the duration of stay for various individual birds within the region. So larger circles represent longer stays, smaller represent shorter stays. So then I'm gonna discuss the harvest exposure. So this was a pretty large focus of my master's. So I was trying to understand how susceptible are lesser yellowlegs to harvest, and are those different breeding populations or populations that I tracked disproportionately exposed to harvest. So just to give you an idea of like the sheer number of birds that are harvested, it's between 4,800 to almost 103,000 individuals that are harvested in the Caribbean zone, which is shown here, the coastal Guyana zone here, and coastal Brazil zone. So those are the main harvest zones. That I focused on. So, in terms of the proportion that were exposed to those harvest regions, so what this figure is basically showing is that populations that originated in Eastern Canada had the highest proportion of exposure. However, even birds from Anchorage, this first figure here, they're a very small proportion of those individuals also went through one of or more of those harvest zones. So in terms of the probability of exposure in any zone, this figure shows that randomly selected individuals from each population occurring in any harvest exposure zone or outside the zone. So what we really found was that the James Bay and Mingan populations had the highest probability of occurrence from about mid-August through October. And that is this curve here. And Anchorage and Canudi had the lowest. So they're all the way down here, almost flat line on the bottom. And so there really is a temporal difference in peak occurrence. And it's really important to understand the timing that different populations occur in these different regions because there are open and closed seasons for a harvest. So it really fluctuates. So maybe birds that do enter these regions aren't as susceptible as others that enter in a different time. So timing really does matter here. All right, so the main question that kind of stemmed off of all this research was, what are these threats? What's happening to these birds? So there were many research questions that came about following the collection of this movement data. So we put all these tags on birds. We found some answers about their basic migration ecology. During the deployment of these tags, we found a lot of nests and became very interested in the breeding ecology. So now there's a graduate student at Trent University that's looking at breeding ecology in Churchill. And then also stemming off of this, we were really interested in, are these different populations genetically unique or similar in any way? So there is another publication led by Katie Christie that kind of came off of all the information that we found from this migration ecology study. And then Shelby at University of Idaho, she's looking at pesticide exposure in the prairie pothole region. We didn't even know these birds necessarily went through that region. So these tags really gave us a lot of information. So we're able to now begin looking at other aspects of the lesser yellowlegs migration ecology, breeding ecology, habitat use. And then there's a new graduate student at the University of Fairbanks that's going to really focus on the habitat conservation within the prairie potholes. And then I just realized yesterday that there's an announcement for a new migration ecology master student to look at not only migration ecology, but also habitat use in New Brunswick, Canada. So there's really a lot of additional studies and that have branched off of this initial research on migration ecology. And there's now an international working group that's dedicated just for lesser yellowlegs. So it's really exciting to see. Okay, so in conclusion, are satellite tags the answer? It all depends. They might be a good choice for large to medium-bodied species, species that are difficult to recapture, or have low breeding site fidelity. They might be good for species that travel through the subarctic or Arctic, where receiving stations are limited, like for MODIS, or where daylight fluctuates. And they're probably good if you want a large sample size, your project probably needs to have pretty deep pockets. So I'm just here throw out my funding sources for the Lesser Yellowlegs project. There were a lot of collaborators that made this possible. And then I mentioned a couple different research studies, so those are listed here. And yeah, I know I went over a little bit, but if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to answer any.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. That was super interesting and such a useful study. And you're actually perfect on timing. We don't have time for questions just for you right now, but there will be a long session at the end where folks can ask questions of both you and Autumn Lynn. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yeah, I'll hand it over to Amy.
Yes, thanks, Laura. That was a really wonderful talk. Very interesting. Yeah, I really liked hearing about your research. And I definitely learned some new stuff about how satellite tags work in terms of communication. So next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Autumn Lynn Harrison, who's going to be our second speaker today. Autumn Lynn is a research ecologist at the Migratory Bird Center at Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute. She studies the ecology and conservation of ocean and coastal migratory species with an emphasis on animal movement, and conducts research using a range of tracking technologies, and leads multiple collaborative research programs, including the Migratory Connectivity Project and the Shorebird Science and Conservation Collective, which is what she'll be speaking to us about today. So thanks so much, Autumn Lynn, for being here. Really looking forward to your talk, and over to you. I think you might be on mute there.
Hi, everyone. I've lost my presentation from the document options. There we go. Okay, you see full screen, everyone? Great.
Yes.
It's really nice to hear Laura's presentation before this one, because Laura is a collaborator on both of the projects that Amy mentioned in my introduction, the Migratory Connectivity Project that contributed to the Lesser Yellowlegs study, and then later contributed data to the Shorebird Science and Conservation Collective that I'll be talking with you about today. This is based at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, where I've worked for the past 10 years. And it really grew out of a couple interacting pieces of information. One, of course, that Laura already mentioned is the really worrying declines of shorebird populations since 1970. We see at the top a picture of waterfowl, which are often thought of as the winners, and then shorebirds and grassland birds being steeply declining populations in North America. But while populations have been
decreasing, information on shorebird migration has been increasing, like the amazing amount of information gained in just a short period of time from Laura's talk. A study done by Amy Scarpignato and collaborators showed that by 2006, less than 1% of tracking studies were comprised of passerine and shorebird studies, so smaller bodied birds. I think Sarah mentioned in the chat that she should be studying chunkier birds, and that plays out in the history of avian tracking studies. But by today, 61% of shorebird species have been tracked. And most tracking studies, I started working on marine mammals and moved to birds, have followed this progression of larger birds carrying satellite tags first, and then moving down the body size. When I first started leading the Migratory Connectivity Project, the smallest satellite tag was 5 grams. Now it's 2, and working on 1 gram. For GPS tags that are archival, it's even smaller. So we are gaining an amazing amount of knowledge in a really rapid period of time. But how to ensure that these data are actually accessible for conservation? We know, of course, that there are many limitations to data sharing for conservation. These include simple things like how to access the data. Are the data open access? Are they available? How to analyze the data. Do conservation practitioners have the specialized expertise to analyze very complicated and messy movement data? And then there can be implementation limitations where conservation practitioners, of course, have many competing priorities and limited time. They may not always be focused on shorebirds or even birds in general, and may not have the time to take advantage of these vast new data sets. And across conservation projects and across scientific studies, there's always a need for strategic integration that can be really difficult to execute on for conservation projects that are spread across many organizations and many geographies. And so having been leading tracking studies on shorebirds since I came to the Smithsonian, working with over 100 different collaborators through the Migratory Connectivity Project, and with a background in large animal tracking in the ocean, I had some models to follow, from BirdLife Seabird Tracking Database to a marine predator tracking project in the Pacific Ocean, to think about how we might start to bring shorebird tracking data together for conservation and really use the insights from tracking data even before they were published. So we know that many student dissertations and other projects are very dependent upon publications, but there's no reason why we can't make these data useful for conservation even before they're open access or published. That can have a lag of 5 to 10 years. So I have been thinking about different models for how to do this and came up with an idea for the Shorebird Science and Conservation Collective to provide a central resource of shorebird data, but really to move beyond the repository approach to provide dedicated staff members for analytical support, to serve the needs of conservation practitioners, and then also to have staff members that could liaise with the conservation practitioners to truly understand their questions and knowledge needs. So with that brainstorm on just this idea, I had been talking with a funder, the Knobloch Family Foundation. They invited a pitch for this idea. And then once I wrote the pitch, they asked if I'd be willing to share it with Rick Langto, who has become an invaluable co-leader of the Shorebird Collective and joined as the chair of the advisory group. So we're organized by having an advisory group of conservation organizations, academics, and more to help advise how we work. And then Allie Anderson, who's on the call, and Candace Stenzel, also on the call, Our staff members supporting the Shorebird Collective, Allie as a quantitative ecologist and Candace as a conservation specialist. So Candace is really the one working with practitioners and making these connections between the data and their projects. And Allie is the one to first take a year to clean up data from various sources and then to actually do the analyses to put the data into action on the ground. Together, the Shorebird Collective has informed projects across land conservation, land and species management, outreach, and policy, and links data contributions to conservation projects. And these data contributions have been many, and they have been very generous. This is a listing of authors to a paper that's in press at Conservation Biology about the Shorebird Collective. There's an earlier preprint available as well, but it has changed a little bit since then, so it should be coming out soon. So our first step after receiving funding from the Knobloch Family Foundation was to request data. And we did this very thoughtfully. We first drafted a data sharing agreement. We hosted a webinar to describe the idea to the research community. We asked for feedback on the data sharing agreement and just got a real community framework going for the agreement to maximize data contributions. The data sharing agreement is very flexible. Some data owners choose to make their data open for conservation for any project without requesting any further notification. Other data contributors may choose to say, hey, could you please ask me for permission before any data use for conservation? And so we have these two different models of contacting contributors when their data might be useful for a project. But either way, we get in touch with the contributor before every project, either to notify them or to ask for further permission. And that approach takes quite a bit of time from the staff, but we've found that it really creates a community. It reduces potential for misinterpretation. It ensures a constant dialogue between the data owners and us as an intermediary to a conservation project. So we think it's really working well, and the only cost is sometimes the administrative overload of contacting contributors, but honestly, we get very quick feedback in response to their request. After we made our request and many contributors signed many data sharing agreements, we have received data that includes 7.1 million tracking locations of shorebirds contributed by 75 organizations across 36 species. And they include over 3,400 individual birds that have been tracked. On the left is just a species richness density plot of these data contributions for Argos and GPS, so higher quality data. And you can see these bright spots through the interior. We did emphasize data contributions from the mid-continent to align with momentum in the mid-continent for shorebird conservation, but we've received data from all over the Western Hemisphere, and you really start to see some of these bright spots where multiple species have been tracked. And I want to note that 18% of the data that have been contributed to the collective are also open access. A higher percent is discoverable on repositories like MoveBank, but may not be open access. So until there's conversion of some of these data sets to publications and then to open access, we're finding a way for those data to still connect with conservation on the ground. Since November 2021, we have supported 26 different conservation projects. We've sent 199 notifications to 30 contributors. 100 of these were pre-approved. So they gave us permission to use the data. We didn't have to notify them, but of course we did. 99 required further permission, and of those, 98% of those requests were approved. When they're not approved is typically because there's a request to include a map in some kind of online publication, and it might scoop a publication that's coming out. But for the most part, everyone's been really generous with sharing data. And 20 species from the contributed species have been considered in conservation projects. I just want to take a short pause here, a little interlude on this story. For our main goal with the Shorebird Collective is really to shorten the pathway between data and conservation. And in thinking about that, I kind of follow a lot of conversations about data visualization and translating knowledge into action. These conversations happen a lot in the health field, public health field, and they happen in other public service situations. So I came across this discussion point where someone once asked, what is the stupidest thing you have seen in data science? This is when Twitter was still Twitter. The feedback says, someone who created an elaborate dashboard, taking months to create, tons of fields, crazy logic, and then a director asked the data scientist to, from this dashboard, that the director could have visited themselves. So it's something that looks like this, a data dashboard, something you might expect a practitioner to visit on their own to get the data that they need. Well, this person was saying that the stupidest thing is that the the director just wanted screenshots sent to them by email weekly. And they were just really shocked that anyone would be doing something that required that much extra work when they had spent so much effort trying to do the data science. And I think as animal ecologists, migration ecologists, we think about this a lot. We publish our science, we put our data in repositories, and we say, now it's open, it's available to be used. But some of the feedback really impressed upon me that other fields are having the same challenges, that most executives don't have the time to interrogate the data. They want to know what the data are. They're just looking for a high-level answer. Or maybe someone else is commenting, is your dashboard even useful and actionable? It might look pretty, but can someone use it? Data scientists who truly understand their stakeholders are a rarity. The use case, in our case, conservation, is always what matters. And thinking about how data don't exist for their own sake, not built so that others could look at it, but built to inform decisions. Shortening the path between the data and the decision should be a priority. So that is kind of the underlying philosophy or vision of the Shorebird Collective, to find ways to shorten the path. It might not always result in a fancy peer review publication, but it's going to get used in some way. And so we have, as a first port of call on our website, a conservation use request form where a practitioner can go and fill in a description of their use case. Sometimes they write us an email, but this helps keep track of the requests that we are receiving from practitioner partners. After they submit a form, we typically get in touch with them and suggest a 1-hour listening session where we hear about their conservation questions. We brainstorm together in sort of a basic co-production approach on how we might answer their questions or inform their conservation project. So we've had a lot of hours of listening sessions with these partners. And we really see very strongly that they would not have the time themselves or sometimes the training to go to a repository and use open access data. For a lot of these projects, the shorebird tracking data would never have made it into conservation, even if they were open. So we asked them about the conservation action. What's their taxonomic focus? Maybe they've been encouraged by a funder to think about shorebirds, but it's not their main focus. This happens sometimes. What's the geographic boundaries that they're interested in? And then any knowledge gaps. Some of them have poked around other resources like eBird or websites previously. And so after those listening sessions, we move forward on supporting the project to translate science to inform things like habitat purchases, easement sightings, habitat incentive programs, and education and outreach. And I'll finish up this talk with some examples of those projects. For every project, we create a final report. There's a picture of a cover of a report on the left that has a summary of the work that we've done and maybe some best practices. We've informed a land conservation project where there was a request to understand how private land adjacent to public lands might be used for shorebirds and might be prioritized for purchase to expand the influence of the park. We've also helped inform site nominations for the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve System. We were contacted by fall flights of American Fish and Wildlife agencies who were interested in understanding whether there were connections between investments in Canadian waterfowl management and shorebirds. And this was a first step in an education outreach kind of campaign I like to think of as Ducks for Shorebirds, where we might better link waterfowl management actions to support shorebirds. And the first step is just making folks aware of the overlap of these bird communities. Ducks for shorebirds. One of our larger projects was a project with Texas Water Trade, Galveston Bay Foundation in Texas, who had purchased the rights to apply water to the landscape to create habitat. And they wanted to know when they should put water on the landscape, how long they should hold it, when are these peaks in migration of birds coming through Texas to help inform this work. And for this project, Allie did a great work overlaying tracking data movements with eBird insights, and then summarizing this in a nice annual cycle of shorebird timing and how it would relate to potential water deployments. The Canadian Wildlife Service has asked us in multiple phases to inform their ocean management risk assessments for offshore wind. There are quite a lot of shorebirds that migrate through potential wind lease areas. And so we've now produced multiple products for them to help inform their risk assessment approach. We had a nice request from the National Fish and Wildlife Refuge in Grays Harbor, Washington, to show real tracking data to students for birds that stopped in their refuge so they could think about their connections more broadly around the world, reaching 870 students across 14 schools. And then I wanted to show specifically how the lesser yellowlegs data have been used in conservation following Laura's talk. 68 tracked individuals have informed 10 different projects. These were contributed by 8 different organizations. And no need to ingest all this, but just showing some example projects ranging from informing surveys in the Amazon basin, to the offshore wind project, to a conservation easement project in Texas, and even in Minnesota and Grasslands National Park, Canada. So some of these projects, especially the smaller ones, probably just wouldn't have had this information available to them. We have a couple of new projects coming online. We've been asked to evaluate the kind of waterfowl priority areas in relationship to shorebird priority areas in the Central Valley of California. So specifically in this joint venture, are the shorebird maps accurately representing areas and habitats that are important to shorebirds? Sometimes funding is dependent on this overlap of species, and they're just not sure that these priority areas are capturing the full suite of habitats used by shorebirds. So we've been asked to help inform this. I'll zoom in on that region. And you can see in the pink is the waterfowl area and the yellow is the shorebird. And you can see it's much more granular than the waterfowl area and possibly even created through different approaches. So this is really how a map like this kind of plays out into funding decisions and conservation projects in the joint ventures. And then we've been asked to inform a status report for the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. They'll be assessing 18 species of Arctic, subarctic breeding shorebirds and would like tracking data to help inform whether they think there are distinct subpopulations or groups of individuals within a species. So that'll be kind of a high-level policy and management project. After all of these projects are finished, I mentioned we report back to the contributors, so they get a notification before the project is finished. We have the nice reports that Candace makes to post on our website. But then this year, Candace also made this really nice Shorebird Collective wrapped GIF. So we could credit the work that's been done over these 3 years. And I'm happy to send this to anyone. It's more involved than this, but here are some example slides to highlight some of the superstar birds that have tracking data that have made it into conservation and the people that contributed those data. So a big thank you to all of those individuals and to all of the birds who carried the tags. And so with that, I'll just end with now open time for questions, I think, and I put my email address here and our website URL so you can all find more, and then look out for that paper that's coming out in conservation biology that will give you all of the detail about how we made the project. Our code is in GitHub, our forms are in GitHub, so we've made everything available so others might be able to model this approach if they wish. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Autumn. That was a really fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. It was great to hear about how you thought about creating the Shorebird Conservation Collective and all the processes, as well as hearing about all these examples of on-the-ground conservation action that's coming from these data. So thanks so much for a really great talk. And yeah, I think we have about half an hour left of the meeting to open up the floor for questions and discussion. Yeah, so if anyone has questions that they'd like to ask, either by speaking or in whichever language you choose, or putting them in the chat is great. I think Julian, you have a question?
Hey, yeah, hi everybody. I arrived a little bit late, but I had heard about your initiative. It's super amazing. So we have data to contribute, but we here in Mexico, Northwest Mexico, we're also in need of data. So the question is, if we would have a request for some project, like, does a project have to be analyzed through you guys, or do we as contributors can also access the wealth of data that you have collected to like analyze it ourselves?
That's a great question, Julian. Something we've kind of grappled with as we've grown in the 3 years. Our initial priority for funding was strongly conservation. This was my priority too, to focus on project requests that have a conservation partnership. So we haven't tended to support as much research-focused projects that may not have a direct conservation partner. So that's one step. In those cases, we encourage people to follow kind of typical scholarly norms where they would get in touch with the data owners and begin a scholarly collaboration, although we are happy to put people in touch. We've asked data owners if they are willing to share their names with people that would like to start a research collaboration. So that's one thing that I didn't mention that some people might be interested in. So we're a good port of call to help facilitate some of those connections. Allie, maybe jump into, I don't think we've had a situation yet where someone has said, we have a conservation question, we have the capacity to analyze the data ourselves. Could we do this? I think we'd be really happy about that actually, because Allie
Really?
is super maxed out with her time. And something I also didn't mention that I'd like to share is that we will soon be posting an announcement for a quantitative assistant because we have received more requests than we really thought. So it's been great, but some of the simpler requests we think an assistant could help with. So we haven't faced that yet. We would probably talk with our advisory group about it and the data owners that would be involved. We just, start a little webinar and just talk about how we could scope that out, but we're always willing to try to find solutions.
Because I think, yeah, that's the big limitations that we all have. Like, first of all, knowing what's out there, and second of all, contacting everybody. Because
Yeah, it's too
just to
hard.
put an example,
Yeah.
if we have a conservation area that we manage and we want to get in touch with like the dozens and dozens of partners to just see what's in there, it's kind of tough for us. But you are a vehicle for that. So we
Yes,
would
so
be
we do
super
that for
interested
you.
to do that and always having in mind a conservation question or application. So I might follow up
Yes,
with your
please
email.
do. We'd be happy to hear more about your information needs for sure.
And we're happy to share data too.
Oh, thanks. That's always what we love to hear. So thank you.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with a question, actually two questions, one of them short for Autumn Lynn. One, you shared some of the awesome conservation projects that you all have helped facilitate. Is there a repository of all of those projects somewhere on the website?
The final reports are being posted kind of slowly. So the PDF documents, we have a review process for that internally and with our partners. Sometimes we need to remove some of the maps from those projects if it involves like a private landowner or something like that. And then Candace also has made a listing of all of our projects. So I'm not sure if we can drop in documents, but we'll try that and drop that listing in that we just released in December. So that's kind of a 3-year summary of the projects. And yeah, we'll keep reporting as we can. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Yeah. And then my other question, I know this isn't kind of the main purpose of the collective, but I'm curious through collecting all of this data, if you all have been able to kind of identify like major gaps, either geographic or in species, and if that's something that you've reported on anywhere.
It's a good question. I think the first resource for that actually comes from the Migratory Connectivity Project, a
Okay.
separate project at Smithsonian, but we've been working to track understudied species to discover their migratory connectivity. And Amy Scarpignato, who's on the line as well, working together with Audubon and their Migratory Bird Explorer, identified gaps in tracking studies across North American birds. Sometimes data aren't discoverable. We might have received data that weren't available to be discovered. I think clearly the gaps are with the smaller species, of course. They just can't, even if they've been tagged with MODIS, it might not be full range data. So there might be data available, but not through their full annual cycle. So Amy's paper in biological conservation is a good first step to look for those gaps. We also submitted to the publisher this year an atlas of migratory connectivity that will have a summary when that book comes out, that will have nice maps and have a good assessment of what's been tracked and what hasn't as well.
Awesome. Any idea when that's going to come out?
Amy, we're hoping 2025. I haven't heard an update, but
Awesome.
yeah.
Great, thank you.
We do have a couple questions in the chat, and if, for anyone, again, like feel free to raise your hand or unmute to ask questions, but you can also put them in the chat if you want to. So Chloe said, amazing work, Autumn Lynn and crew. Is this model going to be looked at for land birds in the future?
We have been asked that if we would be willing to do a grassland model, a duck model, even a bat collective, which is the best name proposed so far. A bat collective, a shark collective. It's one reason that we put all of our forms and our code on GitHub so that other groups could easily recreate this. I think, we'd be willing to support that with additional funding as well, since we already have a good model. But it's been beneficial to have Allie, who's at this amazing intersection of really understanding shorebird natural history, but being also a really strong quantitative ecologist. She's like the holy grail here for shorebirds, and that has helped for data interpretation. So I think if we were to expand, we need funding to ensure that we have someone similar for another guild of birds. But even so, we have all of the forms, and with the conservation biology paper, our idea was just to kind of, publicize the model so that it could be used by others.
Sarah, you have a question?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I just have like a really high level question for both Laura and Autumn Lynn. So I know the subcommittee is for, folks studying migration in many different facets with lots of different tracking technologies and approaches and methods. How do you all feel, just from your personal opinion, how do you feel that tracking has really informed conservation the most? I'm not a shorebird person, so mostly I'm just personally curious how you feel that tracking has really, clearly knowing where they go, but in what area do you think are we making the biggest headway and biggest moves forward for conservation? I know a lot of that is still in progress, but what are you most excited about, I guess, in the tracking world and conservation informing shorebirds in particular?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the Yellowleg study, it's really exciting to see the degree of momentum that has been built off of just, the basic tracking studies, and where the focus is now really in the prairie pothole region. And um, I mentioned that there's a graduate student working, well, there's two graduate students working specifically in that region, and they've actually interacted with local landowners, different farmers, and kind of been able to educate them on that the species occurs here, the threats that they're facing, that sort of thing. But yeah, so it's just been really great to see the momentum that's built just off of tracking one species. But Autumn Lynn, I don't know if you want to add anything else.
It's a good question, Sarah, and I see it happening at multiple levels and scales. The Road to Recovery Initiative and the Lesser Yellowlegs Working Group is really working integratively across the annual cycle, across physiology, across movement ecology. So that's really neat to start to integrate movement with other parts of bird ecology. That's going to be one of the big advances. But I come from the marine ecology world, and the seabird tracking database was the first. It was the first tracking data repository across any taxa in early 2000, late 1999. And they were such an inspiration for me. I've worked with that team. They have informed like major global treaties and conservation areas, entire new high seas marine protected areas solely from tracking data. And that's really been from the power of sharing and then also starting to synthesize across time and space. And so I think as the Shorebird Collective grows, we certainly have showed that we can mobilize these data to inform lots of small projects and regional projects, but some of the greater power will be in the synthesis and thinking more strategically and planning across the hemispheres. So that's where I see this going and where our advisory group is encouraging us as well. As long as, again, we have a clear mechanism for the conservation action and it's not just a paper for a paper's sake.
Yeah, I think a lot of us get caught up in the individual projects and the exciting field parks and stuff like that. Yeah, but so the synthesis is really cool to try and get a lot more attention to it and scale up a lot of these actions. So yeah, it's great.
Camilla, I think you have a question.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I have a question for Autumn Lynn. So I couldn't help noticing that all the conservation projects that you've advised or helped are in North America. And so my question has two parts. One, are you willing to help out conservation projects outside of North America? And two, how does it work for a project to approach you? Do we have to pay you guys to do the analysis, or how does it work?
Great questions, both of them. Our funder was initially interested in using North America as a proof of concept. So that's why the focus over the first 3 years on North America, although we have supported a project with Manomet in the Amazon basin. We're also approached about a wind energy development initiative in Argentina. But with the limited staff, we realized we just don't have enough. So we have applied to an NMBCA grant this year to bring on a staff from Latin America and the Caribbean to support expanding the Shorebird Collective to conservation projects in Latin America. So this is a really strong and high priority of ours to hopefully have a person who has quantitative skills, conservation connections, who will be based in Latin America, who can really harness the Shorebird Collective for use in Latin America. So yeah, thank you for that really thoughtful question. I wish us luck on the grant as well.
Just a side idea, when you have that project posted, Autumn Lynn, we have a really big and diverse audience on this listserv for this group with lots of international partners, so it may be a good way to help spread the word.
Thank you so much. Great.
Okay, well, while other people think of questions, we had one more in the chat. Fabi actually asked, it is so fascinating what we can learn from tracking a species, and it takes a lot of effort and funds. Is there a way to explore how these tracking studies that focus on species that belong, oh, sorry, just jumped down, that belong to heavily declining bird groups inform or guide knowledge on other species in the community? Not sure if either of our speakers want to take on that question or anyone else in the group.
I'm reading it again. I was brain dead.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay. Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know, even Allie, if you want to chime in. We have thought about this kind of, this gets at the question of surrogate species and what species do we have a lot of data for that might be able to represent other species. Allie, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I feel like there's multiple parts to this question, but I'll focus on maybe the first part. I will say that very rarely have we received a request that's for a single species. People want to know, like, how can I support shorebirds? Any of them. We want any information on shorebirds. And so this is kind of a contrast to a way that a lot of research is conducted. It's often species specific, other than like survey monitoring, right? So this has been quite interesting, just like on a personal exploring data and trying to support projects level, because we often do see mixed species assemblages within the tracking data that are often, associated with areas of high abundance, you might expect like western sites or, wildlife management areas. But we have often thought to ourselves, is there a way we could tell, like, are some species indicative of other ones? Like a lot of times it's an assumption that, like, okay, these species are what you'd expect in a wetland habitat, for example. But then sometimes we can see a species that you maybe wouldn't expect. So I think there's a lot of opportunities from learning from data combined together. Like Autumn Lynn mentioned before, the challenge is that we really want to make sure the data is being used quickly for conservation projects. So we haven't like pursued a lot of these like more integrative questions because they could become more theoretical, right? Just one idea.
I forgot to mention the other or answer the other part of Camila's question, which was, do we provide these services for free? That's a really important part of that question, and I'm sorry I forgot it. We currently have funding to support conservation requests for free, so we want to do this as much as possible. For many of the smaller groups we partner with, they wouldn't have the ability to pay for this information, and we feel like these insights should be free, but of course they require staff time. So we are also partnering with groups who might be able to provide funding for a project. They have funding for a specific project. They don't have staff to do it. Shout out to Christian, who's on the line from ECCC. And so partnering on projects that they might be able to contract the Shorebird Collective to do this and therefore help keep the Shorebird Collective alive and fund projects and pursuing grants like NMBCA. So the main objective, yes, is to keep these support services for free, but when possible, if folks have funding to support the science work, we really appreciate it. And we'll have to think about this more and more just to keep the Shorebird Collective sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a couple other questions for Laura while we wait for other folks to think of questions. My first question is just how expensive is a single satellite tag typically?
Yeah, so when we were purchasing them, they were $1,500 a piece.
Okay.
That definitely could have changed since 2020 when we last purchased these. Like I said, I work in data management now, so I'm kind of out of the loop a bit. But yeah, it was a very expensive project to put out 100 of those tags.
Yeah.
But there are, yeah, Autumn. That's true. There are some that are even more expensive for sure. Yeah, and I know there's these new, they're similar type tags, but they use solar, and I'm not sure the price of those, but those have definitely gained some momentum recently because they weigh a little bit less than the Argos tags that I was describing.
Are those like the sunbird ones?
Right, yes, yeah.
Okay, okay. Okay. Not the answer I was hoping for, but useful to know. And then my other question is, it's really like, it seems like through your research, you've gotten some conservation research projects and implementation projects going in the prairie potholes. And I'm curious if your tracking data has been able to inform conservation work in the Caribbean and Northern South America, like to work with communities or governments to like disincentivize hunting or to, change the season to make the timing better.
Yeah, there has been some partners, several partners in the Caribbean and South America that have been interested in conducting their own research down in those areas where we showed that they're hot spots for lesser yellowlegs. in terms of what's going on currently, like I said, I'm not really in the loop, so I'm probably not the best person to answer this. But yeah, there's definitely interest. There's been some work going on. Um, yeah, I guess if you have specific questions, I would reach out to the members of the Lesser Yellowlegs International Working Group. I think they have a website now within the Road to Recovery webs page. So yeah, they probably will be able to provide more information on specifics.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
I have one question for Laura about the Yellowlegs study. I remember you mentioned that the two easternmost sites that you tagged out, James Bay and Mingan, that those were mostly birds captured on migration. And I was wondering how long the tags you used lasted and whether you got any return northbound migrations for those birds that were tagged at those sites as far as the breeding grounds and whether you had an idea of where they were breeding.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We did. So, um, I believe there were two or three birds that were tagged in the James Bay region, where we received data through spring migration and into part of summer, and it appeared that they were actually within Newfoundland and Labrador area. So they were likely breeding over in that region, which was really exciting to see.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The James Bay and Mingan, or just the Mingan birds? Just that Mingan's a lot
No, I'm
closer to
pretty sure it
Newfoundland.
was, I could be wrong. I haven't looked at this in a while, but I'm pretty sure it was the James Bay
Oh,
birds.
that's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So,
Well, thank you.
yeah.
All right, we have another question in the chat, which I think is maybe for a more general question for the group. Is there interest/funding to give workshops focused on the analysis or the data generated by these tracking technologies, especially to Latin American researchers and practitioners?
Ken, are you going to answer that question? Or do you have a different question? Yeah, funding. There have been various workshops at different meetings, AOS meetings, Western Hemisphere Shorebird Group meetings, but it's kind of up to whoever wants to do it in any given year and what the focus of their analytical methods are, but maybe others on the line know a lot more about that. There's also a global Animove course, which provides nice training and scholarships for the analysis of animal tracking data. This is hosted by Max Planck. In some years, there's been an American version, but that's a nice way to learn as well, and they take applications.
Sorry, can you repeat what that's called?
Yes, it's called Animove. And I think they have a past year's sessions on a YouTube channel as well to be able to watch.
Ken, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to continue the northeastern lesser yellowlegs questioning a tiny bit because I noticed that the track from the James Bay is the one that went over upstate New York, where I am, and we have at the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, it's sort of regional, but we get thousands of lesser yellowlegs every fall. And it looks like that's an area where there hasn't been much study, yet that's the population exposed most to the Caribbean hunting, whereas all the stopover stuff in the prairie potholes is great, but that's not the population that's being hunted. So anyway, just a sort of an encouraging folks to maybe think about some of these smaller sites in the Northeast, including Montezuma Refuge that are, really important for yellowlegs, and it's been very, very frustrating. They just cannot manage water levels for these shorebirds, and that sort of ducks for shorebirds project is very interesting because that's what we've been trying to do locally, and the refuges have a lot of trouble doing this. So I think it's an area where some more work needs to be done.
Any other questions? We have just a couple more minutes here.
I'm going to go ahead and put the Google form one last time in the chat just in case anyone wasn't here when it went in before. If you'd like to sign up for the official listserv, please fill this out.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate or to say for those who weren't here at the first webinar, that really part of the goal of this subcommittee is to think about and develop collaborations around research or conservation projects across the Americas. And so that's really the purpose of this Google spreadsheet to people can add ideas for projects they have. They could be potential projects that don't exist yet, or existing projects that are looking for new collaborators. So really, we want to be sort of using these webinars to learn about new technologies and their applications and think about how we can apply them to new species, new projects, new regions. So we'll be sending out an email via the listserv about that spreadsheet and how you can contribute to it. Yeah, and I guess just to close out, thank you so much to both of our speakers for those really awesome talks. I learned a lot about satellite tracking technology and how it's being used. So yeah, really, really appreciate those talks and all of your really insightful answers to the questions. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to add before we close.
Yeah, thanks so much for the wonderful talks, Laura and Autumn Lynn, and thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see such a good turnout. And also, I want to say thank you so much to Claudia, who's done the interpretation for us today, which is, is really important. So thank you so much for that as well. All right.
Great.
Well, thanks again, everyone, and we hope to see you next time.
Yeah, look out for the email about the next date.
Bye all.
Hi.